consequences of war reverberate beyond the battlefield, as do the consequences of a history ignored. For the governor and myself, this is one of our guiding principles, that in order to move forward, we must acknowledge the full truth of our past. But to do that requires the work and sacrifice of heroes like Jeanne Wakatsuki Houston, a woman who bravely shared her own experiences to indelibly and beautifully bring to life one of the most painful chapters of California history. Growing up in Inglewood, California, the youngest of 10 siblings, Jeanne Wakatsuki was just 7 years old when her family was uprooted from their home. They were imprisoned, along with thousands of other Japanese Americans, in the throes of anti-Japanese hysteria following the attack on Pearl Harbor. She spent 3 years a prisoner of her own country at the Manzanar camp in Northern California. Refusing to be defeated by this chapter in her life, Jeanne wrote Farewell to Manzanar with her husband in 1973, drawing on her experiences during and after her family's imprisonment, and making her book one of the first publications to discuss the mass incarceration of Japanese Americans during World War II. Taught in classes across the nation, I myself remember vividly reading the book. Her book sold over 1 million copies and is now in its 79th printing, forever opening our eyes to the dangerous consequences that follow when we question someone's belonging to his country based on the color of their skin. A lesson we would do well to heed today. It is because of brave voices like hers that our march towards justice continues. And it is because of brave voices like hers that California can continue to be a beacon of light and progress, not in spite of, but because of our past flaws. And for that, it is our honor and it is our privilege to welcome Jeanne Wakatsuki Houston into the California Hall of Fame.
Good evening, everyone. And thank you so much for that kind and generous introduction. And I also would like to take this time to thank Governor Newsom and Jennifer for their part in adopting this, the California Hall of Fame. I mean, I think it's extraordinary that we have this event and that it carries on, and that we, honor our history, quote, good and bad. In 1971, my nephew, who was attending UC Berkeley, was taking a sociology class. And for the first time in his life, outside of talk and family, heard the word Manzanar. Auntie, he said, I was born in Manzanar, and I know nothing of that place. What can you tell me? Well, okay, I'd be happy to tell you, but why don't you ask your parents? He said, I have, but they seem very reluctant, and they don't answer. And I actually feel bad, like I shouldn't be asking them. That's strange, I thought. Whenever our family talked about, quote, camp, which was rare, we joked about things such as the lousy food, the dust storms, the communal showers. We talked lightheartedly about outdoor movies, and, excuse me, I'm getting over this cough. And so for many years, Manzanar remained a dim memory, something the family rarely talked about. I used to dream that those years in camp were not real, and it wasn't until 28 years later that I revived those dreams and collaborated with my husband to write about them. And this is how it happened. In 1971, my nephew, who was attending UC Berkeley, came to visit me in Santa Cruz. He was taking a sociology class, and for the first time in his life, outside of talk in the family, heard the word Manzanar. "Auntie," he said, "you know I was born in Manzanar, and I don't know anything about that place. What can you tell me?" His professor had pointed out the existence of camps, but that was all. Until then, Manzanar had seemed more a family myth than an actual fact to my nephew. "Okay," I said, "but why don't you ask your folks?" "I have," he said, "but they're reluctant, like I shouldn't be asking, or there's some skeleton in the closet I'm not supposed to know about." That's strange, I thought. Whenever our family talked about camp, which wasn't often, we joked about things such as the lousy food, the dust storms, the communal showers. We talked lightheartedly about the outdoor movies, baseball games, and school. So I proceeded to tell the same stories in the same superficial way, as if I was sharing some summer camp experience. My nephew looked at me, very quiet, then said, "Auntie, that's bizarre. You were locked up. You were in prison. How do you feel about that?" For a moment, I was stunned. He asked a question no one had ever asked before, a question I had never dared to ask myself. How did I feel? And for the first time in my life, I dropped the cover of humor and nonchalance and allowed myself to feel, and I began to cry. I couldn't stop. My poor nephew was upset. What had he done to send his auntie into this hysterics? I realized then why his parents were unable to tell him about Manzanar. At that time, I was auntie to 33 nieces and nephews. 7 had been born in camp. And I was, and I was certain none knew about their birthplace. I decided to write a memoir, a history, just for the family. But I found that whenever I tried to write, I broke down and cried and just could not write my words. So I turned to my husband, a writer and teacher at UC Santa Cruz, and told him of my problem. "What memoir?" he asked. Now, Jim and I had been married 14 years at that time, and I had known him for 5 before we married, and I had never told him about Manzanar. He knew of some camp in my background, but I had never revealed my true feelings, and when I did, he said, "This is not a story just for your family. It's a story everyone in America should know. Let's work on this together." Thus began a collaboration that lasted for a year. I talked for hours into a tape recorder, and we interviewed family and other internees and researched the libraries. The months spent delving into those 3 years of my childhood and its aftermath was as powerfully therapeutic as years with a psychiatrist, and a lot cheaper. We found there were already 40 books written on the internment, but they were academic and political. We found no personal stories from internees themselves that addressed the emotional and psychological damage of that experience. Not only was there the cultural attitude, "Shikata ga nai," it's over and can't be helped. The phenomenon of post-traumatic stress syndrome, unknown 30 years ago, had silenced most internees. Today we know the experience of death, divorce, sexual abuse, and parental alcoholism can remain buried in the subconscious until the memory surfaces years later, usually 30 or 40. I realized the feeling I carried up about the incarceration was one of deep humiliation, like a person who had been raped. You are the victim, yet you are sullied by that experience, ashamed to draw attention to it. For years, I felt guilty for the bombing of Pearl Harbor. Somehow, I was responsible for that infamous event. When I asked my mother, "Why are we in this prison camp?" I was then too young to understand war and politics. And she said, "It's because we are Japanese." She didn't say anything about a war with Japan. So in my mind, it was not only bad to be Japanese, it was criminal. Feeling guilty for the bombing of Pearl Harbor is similar to the feeling many Americans have for the atomic blast over Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Thus, crimes of a government can become sins of the people, especially in the mind of an innocent child. Today, there are all too many politicians and irresponsible media who find scapegoats to blame for the country's problems. And more, it seems, those scapegoats are immigrants. How often do we hear they are different from us? They have no idea of democracy and freedom. They don't and won't speak our language. For many of us who lived through the racism and incarceration of Japanese Americans during World War II, remember what it was like to have those very words directed against one innocent group. But today, we know better. We have the shoulders of Martin Luther King and others to stand upon. Our consciousness has changed, and because of this, our task is greater. For now, we are in a partnership, a complex relationship where we must learn about each other. No longer do we live in the simplistic structure of one group authoritatively dominating others. And with these words, I will close and say thank you so much, audience, for listening. And I want to thank the Governor, State of California, for this award. Thank you. Thank you. Can I take one of those? Yeah. Oh.